the smell of napalm in the morning.
In the Western imagination, Vietnam is mostly known for its recent past as a battlefield in which the military supremacy of the United States had faltered. In more recent years, it's been a destination for backpacking tourists. However, there is so much more to Vietnam than that. This is a long, slender country guided by the forces of latitude rather than longitude, more than any other outside of maybe Chile. This slender strip, stretched across the eastern Indo-Chinese peninsula, contains hills and tropical rainforests, providing natives with protections from outsiders. Being in the tropics, this nation not only has access to the salt water of the Pacific, but also the fresh water of the Mekong River. A vast series of waterways across the mainland of Southeast Asia, providing not only fresh water for humans and rice grains alike, but also some of the greatest biodiversity of freshwater fish and crustaceans on the planet, only to be rivaled by the Amazon. These waters pool into the Mekong Delta, which has become the epicenter of agriculture for both crops and aquaculture, with stunning biodiversity and economic productivity. But also ecological vulnerabilities, given the fact that there's a great deal of coastline erosion and flooding due to rising temperatures. Moving to the north, you get to the Gulf of Tonkin, infamous for the event that sparked the Vietnam War. The hilly jungles provide Vietnam protection from neighboring countries, most notably the adversary China. Their long coastline also provides them a vast network of maritime trade routes, but at the same time their narrow landmass lacks strategic depth, and external powers can choke off the north from the south. The hills and abundance of freshwater provide the basis for rice paddies that straddle this nation's elevation, providing calories for its large population and intensive work ethics that provided the foundation for the nation's strong productivity. To the north lies the Red River Delta, which is close in proximity to China, and this is where you see a great deal of Chinese customs and institutions that they adopted from their more powerful northern neighbor. The northern parts of what are now Vietnam were eventually subjugated by Han China. This would spark hostility between the far more powerful neighbor to the north that still exists to this day. Influence from the Indian subcontinent would eventually arrive, bringing in Hinduism and later Buddhism. The Chinese would eventually try to take over the land every now and then, especially under the Song dynasty, but were eventually repulsed. The people of this land under the Tran dynasty of what is now Vietnam would eventually be able to beat back Mongol invasions multiple times. If you can already tell, this land has a pretty good track record of bringing imperialists to their knees. Various states shifted their power projections across the span of decades, with occasional short-lived invasions by China. Eventually, Europeans arrived on the shores, first the Portuguese, then the Spanish, Dutch, British, and most of all the French. The French would turn Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos, or the land that is now composed of these nations, into French Indochina. The French did do a great deal of colonial subjugation, but there are still many French cultural elements that exist in Vietnam to this day, particularly seen in food. During World War II, the Japanese would invade France, or more accurately, French Indochina, not France, but you get what I'm saying. Initially, some natives welcomed the Japanese as liberators from French imperialism, but this was short-lived due to the brutality of Imperial Japan. Eventually, communist rebels, namely the Viet Minh, rose up led by Ho Chi Minh to kick the Japanese out, with the support of the Soviet Union and China. Ho Chi Minh declared independence, but was met with a long drawn-out war of independence with France, which resulted in a communist victory and mass movement of Catholics to the south. While the south was independent from the communist north, the Viet Cong, also known as the National Liberation Front, fought against the southern government, which was backed by the US. The US started to provide air support and then Marines. Now, the Vietnam War has been talked about endlessly, so I'm not going to dwell on it. We all know it became deeply unpopular, perhaps the most unpopular war in American history, and eventually the US fled as the North took over the South. With the absence of the US, the Soviet Union and China would then fight their own proxy war, with Moscow supporting Vietnam and China supporting Pol Pot in Cambodia, a regime that killed nearly a fifth of its own people. The Vietnamese would eventually come out victorious. China invaded Vietnam in 1979, but failed to subjugate the country, pushing Vietnam into the Soviet sphere. By the 1980s, market reforms were introduced, and while the government is still authoritarian, it did lax up a bit, at least provided some more economic freedom in the country, which resulted in more economic growth. Today, Vietnam is still a one-party country, and by and large, it still has some communist policies. However, they've been watered down over the decades. Today, it's a mix of a planned economy and a market economy with a more substantial private sector. However, there are no mega corporations that are from Vietnam, as the government tends to still have a major role in the economy and industry. The country has, however, opened up to foreign investment and has a thriving tourism industry that would have been unthinkable 30 years ago. But due to the country's very rich culture and natural landscapes, it has now become an economic sector. Traditionally, the economy has been based off of fisheries and agriculture. Its long coastline is perfect for shrimp aquaculture along the mangroves, even though this has led to a lot of ecological destruction. The country also relies on fisheries and the freshwater ecosystems, and Vietnam is the major producer of various crops, rice being the most important by far, followed by sugarcane, bananas, cassava, coffee, and pineapples. While this region was once a major force in the rubber trade back in the day, its importance has by and large dwindled, mostly because there's now synthetic rubber. With the rise of wages in China, many international corporations are now moving manufacturing to Vietnam. Speaking of China, let's move on to foreign relations. Today, China, while having many cultural ties with Vietnam as well as strong trade relations, is by and large its largest threat. The Vietnamese have focused on multilateralism and self-reliance in the face of their foreign policy adversaries. And this has often made them the target of various world powers, but they've managed to defeat them on numerous occasions. After all, by the 1990s, Vietnam's relationship with the West warmed up, especially the US, regaining formal diplomatic status under the Clinton administration. As strange as it sounds, Vietnam has one of the most pro-American populations, as this young population has not lived during the Vietnam War. And, by and large, many Vietnamese people see the US as a balancing factor against the Chinese. Obama even lifted the arms embargo on Vietnam. And given the collapse of the Soviet Union and the waning power of Russia, some Vietnamese are looking to the US and its allies like Japan and Australia as partners against Chinese expansion in the South China Sea. While some argue that Vietnam will be a close ally of the US in the face of China building man-made islands in the South China Sea, this is unlikely to happen in full force. At the end of the day, the Vietnamese do value some degree of independence. On top of that, it's still highly autocratic, which does make some major democratic forces in the Pacific, like Japan and Australia, a little bit queasy. Nonetheless, this country has been the sort of graveyard of empires, and will most likely fend off any challenges that arrive in this way, be it the Chinese, Mongols, Japanese, French, Americans, or otherwise. In other words, don't mess with Vietnam.